The wolf pup was 3 weeks old and screaming into an empty forest. That sound, high, broken, relentless, had been going for hours by the time it reached the farmhouse. It cut through the tree line like something that had given up on being ignored. Inside, stretched across the kitchen floor with her head between her paws, a Rottweiler named Hera lifted one ear. Then both. Then she was at the door. She did not bark, she did not pace, she sat at the back door and looked at it until Frank Colby, 67 years old, a retired forest ranger who had lived on this Montana property for 31 years, got up from his chair, set down his coffee, and opened it. What happened next, what Hera found in those trees, what she carried back in the gentlest mouth a 100-pound Rottweiler has ever had, and what a wolf who was raised in a farmhouse kitchen did 2 years later when the man who had kept him alive needed him most, is a story that will stay in you long after you finish watching. The Bitterroot Valley in western Montana is wolf country. It always has been, and after the reintroduction programs of the 1990s, it became wolf country again in the full, unambiguous sense. Packs moving through the timber, territories overlapping with ranch land, the old tensions between predator and human running just below the surface of every interaction. Frank Colby had spent 30 years as a forest ranger in this landscape. He understood wolves the way you understand something you have spent a career watching without ever fully closing the distance. He followed Hera into the trees that morning at a jog for a man of 67, which meant carefully and with one hand on a fence post whenever the ground went uneven. She moved ahead of him without urgency, her big black and tan body steady and low, following a sound he could now hear clearly. A wolf pup, in distress, close. He found her standing over a shallow depression in the root base of a fallen larch. 3 wolf pups had been born there. 2 were dead, had been for some time. The cold had seen to that. The 3rd was alive and screaming, and Hera was already lying down around it. The mother wolf was nowhere. Frank found her tracks leading east, then blood, then nothing. She had been shot. He found the casing 60 meters out, a single round fired from a position that suggested someone who had waited, someone who had known. Frank stood in those trees for a long time. Then he took off his vest, wrapped the pup in it without touching the animal with bare hands, let Hera guide him back to the house, and called the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks before he reached the porch. The wildlife officer who responded was a woman named Deputy Warden Celia Marsh, 41 years old, experienced and direct, who had worked wolf cases in the Bitterroot for 9 years and had seen most of what this landscape could produce. She arrived within 2 hours, examined the scene, took photographs, collected the casing, and filed the report that would begin what became a 14-month criminal investigation. She also looked at the pup, now in a cardboard box in Frank's kitchen, with Hera lying pressed against the outside of it, the Rottweiler's broad black head resting on the box edge, watching the pup breathe. "You know this is a wolf," Celia said. "I know," Frank said. "You know what the regulations say about raising a wolf." "I know that too," Frank said. "But I'd like to talk about what happens to him if he leaves this kitchen tonight." Celia looked at the pup. She looked at Hera. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll make some calls," she said. What resulted was a carefully arranged cooperation between Frank, the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and a licensed wolf recovery specialist named Dr. Owen Rask, 58 years old, methodical and bearded, who drove up from Missoula twice a week to monitor the pup's development and manage the paperwork that made the arrangement legal. The pup would be raised at the property under monitored conditions with the clear goal of eventual wild release. Frank would provide the home. Hera, apparently, would provide everything else. The pup, Frank called him Gray because that was what he was, a gray pup on a gray November morning, and Frank was not a man who spent long on names, were in critical condition for the first 5 days. Hera did not leave his side. She cleaned him. She warmed him. She absorbed his frantic, exhausting energy with the implacable calm of a 100-pound dog who had never in her life been rattled by anything smaller than herself. By day 6, Gray was feeding from a specialized bottle Celia had sourced from the wildlife department. By day 10, he was attempting to climb Hera's leg. By 3 weeks, he was ambushing her tail from behind the water bowl, and Hera was enduring it with the expression of an animal who had expected exactly this and had made her peace with it. They grew up in parallel, Gray burning bright and fast the way wolf pups do, hitting developmental milestones faster than domestic dogs, his instincts arriving sharp and early. Hera met every stage with the same unshakable composure. When Gray howled his first real howl at 4 months, a sound that came out of him like something unlocked, Hera lifted her head, listened, then lay back down. She understood what she had raised. She had always understood. Dr. Rask began the wildness preparation protocol at 6 months, controlled exposure to forest environments, prey scent, territorial ranging behaviors. Gray took to all of it with an appetite that the wildlife team documented as exceptional. He was not confused about what he was. He knew what he was. He had simply been loved in a kitchen first. At 14 months, Gray was assessed for release. He was healthy, instinct complete, a full-size gray wolf in the prime of his first year. He was released into a protected corridor of the Bitterroot with monitoring equipment and 2 camera trap networks covering his initial ranging territory. Frank and Hera were not at the release. Frank had asked not to be. He stood on his porch that evening and looked east at the tree line and said nothing, which is how Frank handled most things that mattered. 8 months after the release, on a November morning that had come in sharp and cold, Frank Colby had a medical event in his back field. He had been clearing a fence line alone, which his doctor had told him twice not to do, and he went down hard and did not get back up. His phone was on the kitchen table. He was 200 meters from the house. The temperature was dropping. Hera found him within minutes. She did what dogs do. She stayed, she pressed her warmth against him, she barked until she had no more bark. But the nearest neighbor was 1.5 miles away, and the road was not traveled in the morning. What came out of the eastern tree line 40 minutes later, the camera field on the fence post would capture in full. Gray. He crossed the back field at a run, slowing only when he reached Frank, circling him once like a wolf assesses situations, then sitting close, not lying down, sitting, upright, oriented toward the road. He began to howl, not a distress howl, a directional call, repeated and consistent, the kind that carries through cold air for distances that a bark cannot reach. He howled for 11 minutes before a truck on the county road slowed, then stopped, then turned up the long gravel drive. Frank was airlifted to hospital in Missoula. He recovered fully. The attending physician said another 40 minutes in that field would have produced a different outcome. Gray was back in the eastern tree line before the ambulance reached the road. The camera on the fence post caught him at the edge of the forest, pausing once and looking back at the house, then he was gone. The man who had shot Gray's mother was identified through ballistic analysis of the casing Celia had collected that first morning, cross-referenced with a registered firearm during an unrelated stop 14 months later. He was charged with illegal killing of a federally protected species under the Endangered Species Act. He was prosecuted in federal court. He was convicted. He served a 2-year imprisonment and a substantial fine. He served the sentence. The wolf who he had tried to erase was alive and running in the Bitterroot. His mother's territory had been surveyed and formally incorporated into the protected recovery corridor the following spring. Frank Colby went back to his fence line 6 weeks after his discharge. His doctor had told him not to. He went anyway. But this time he took Hera, and this time he kept his phone in his pocket, and this time when he looked up at the eastern tree line, he took a moment before he went back to work. Because he knew what was in those trees, and it knew he was there. If this story got into you the way it should, hit that like button and subscribe right now. We bring stories like this to you every week because the world is full of them, and most people never hear them. Share it with someone who needs to believe that what you raise comes back for you. Thank you for watching.